So today we are going to talk about digital sequence information. Around 18 months ago, there was a PRIMA presentation webinar for CGIAR scientists on this topic, on digital sequence information and the situation of this in the international arena. So a lot of things have happened since then. And digital sequence information has become a topic for different international regulatory regimes that deal with genetic resources in different ways. So, for example, there is the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Nagoya Protocol that deals with all genetic resources, the International Plant Treaty that deals with crop genetic resources, the World Health Organization, the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness that deals with viruses, influenza viruses, and genetic resources related to that, and the UN High Seas Treaty that deals with marine biodiversity beyond waters, beyond national jurisdiction waters, that deals also with access and benefit sharing and conservation of those resources. So digital sequence information has become the topic of these regimes. And the reason is that there has been an explosion on availability of sequence information and genome data out there. So there is an estimated 280 million sequences in these databases, the International Network of Databases. In 2002 is downloaded more than 30 million times per year. It has around 40 million users. And the thing is that to access that digital sequence information, sometimes there is no need to access the physical resources that contain that digital sequence information. So most of the regimes, international regimes that we saw in the former slide, deal with benefit sharing related to access and use of the physical resource. So there has been a perception, and right so, of some undermining of benefit sharing related to access, the information related to the physical resource and the physical resource itself. And now that has an influence in the way we work at gene banks, at breeding programs, and different genotyping activities. So today, we are going to revisit the topic, and we are going to give you, an update information on where are we, in digital sequence information, benefit sharing, why it has become important, why it is changing the way we use genetic resources, the implications for benefit sharing, what is happening at the level of the CGIAR centers in generation, storage, sharing of that type of information, what is the status of the international negotiations around digital sequence information, what has been the engagement of the centers and what will be and the issues going forward. We have different presenters for that. I'm going to introduce them in a moment. They are going to share with you the insights on these topics. For every one of the presentations, you will be able to ask questions. We would like you to use the question and answer facility that is in Zoom to post your questions. Otherwise, you can raise your hand after each of the sessions, or during the session, you put your questions, and we will give you the opportunity, to ask and for us to answer the questions there. And and at the end, we also have a question and answer session. So I'm going to introduce our expert speakers of today. Michael Hellwood is a PhD in law, is a principal scientist at the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CGIAR. He's the leader of the Genetic Resources and Seed Systems Policy Group. And at the policy group of the CGIAR Gene Banks initiatives, he coordinates the CGIAR engagement in negotiations for the development of international access and benefit sharing laws. Rory Sackville-Hamilton, he is an evolutionary biologist. He is the former head of the International Rice Gene Bank at IRRI. He has been a collaborator and advisor for several international organizations. He was the recipient of a Crop Trust Legacy Award in 2018, and he worked closely with the policy group of the Gene Banks initiative in all these aspects related to genetic resources and information and benefit sharing. Isabel Lopez Noriega, she is a policy and legal specialist with the Alliance, also Alliance of Biodiversity International and CGIAR. As part of the policy group, she works with the CGIAR position in international negotiations around this topic, genetic resources, related information, including digital sequence information. And Matthew Howard, he is a senior scientist at the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CGIAR, and has an expertise. Matthew has an expertise on genomics and informatics, and is the leader of the team on data analysis development of tools applied to plant genetic resources for sequence information. So with them, you are in very good hands, to talk about these topics. Before starting on these topics, actually, we would like to know about our audience today. And if you don't mind, we will conduct a couple of polls. Once, if you are linked to a CGIAR initiative where you conduct most of the work, we would like to know that. If you are not part of a CGIAR initiative, what group you are working at. And if you work with genetic resources, what is the main focus of that work? And for that, I will leave you with Michael Howard. So Michael, the floor is yours.
I'm now going to provide a very quick introductory overview of why benefit sharing and digital sequence information has become such a hot topic. And it's going to be a fairly quick overview because A, we have a lot of ground to cover in this webinar and not much time, and B, we now have the luxury of referring you back to the recording of the first webinar we put on for CGIAR scientists back in May of 2022, concerning digital sequence information and benefit sharing. So as Carolina said, this is the second now such webinar. So we can send you to the first, and if you're interested in some of the issues that we gloss over in this webinar, you're welcome to go back and look at that previous webinar recording. Cinzia has now in the chat sent out the link to that. Yeah. Now, but before we get into the issues that led to DSI becoming a hot topic, I wanted to spend a few moments talking about what it is we mean, or what it is we think we mean, when we're talking about digital sequence information, or DSI. In fact, what we want to do right now is get your thoughts about that. So we've developed yet another Slido poll on that particular topic. And here's the question. What do you think is included in the definition of DSI? So what do you think we're talking about when we talk about DSI? The first reasonable response is, I don't know. The second is DNA only. So that's the sort of strictest definition of what you might mean by DSI. Then there's DNA and RNA together. So getting a little bit broader. DNA, RNA, and proteins, broader still. The fourth possibility is DNA, RNA, proteins, and metabolites. And a fifth possible scope of what's meant by digital sequence information is DNA, RNA, proteins, metabolites, and associated traditional knowledge. So please choose what it is you think we're talking about from this list when we talk about DSI. Okay, let's see what we have. Well, that's interesting. So several people going for the broadest possible definition, the majority or the largest minority going for the fourth category, and very few going for the strictest, or fewer cumulatively going for the three most strictly narrowly defined categories. And only a few, the lowest number saying, I don't know. And now, as it turns out, the fact is the international community hasn't actually come yet to an agreement on the definitive DSI. So in fact, those of you who indicated you don't know are in a sense closest to the actual state of affairs. None of us are quite sure what it means, at least not for the purposes of the negotiations that we're going to be talking about today. The Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity in 2020 published a very useful paper providing a framework of analysis for thinking through what might be included in the scope of the definition. And you'll see from this excerpt from that paper that we've borrowed the groupings, this sort of sliding scale of what may be included in the definition of DSI. But as of yet, there has been no agreement about this. In fact, there is no agreement that we actually need a definition of DSI, because for some of the options for benefit sharing that we'll be talking about later today, you don't need a definition. Sort of the broadest, most wide open formula for benefit sharing maybe don't require us to have a definition of DSI. So in the meantime, this is sort of the framework of analysis to which negotiators to date have been referring back. So this paper has a kind of a life of its own, and it's still a very useful reference for this kind of discussion. Now, I want to talk about 5 contributing factors to why digital sequence information and benefit sharing has become such a hot topic. And of course, there's some risk of oversimplification, but here goes. The first baseline contributing factor is the fact that most of the world's biodiversity has evolved in the global south. And that, of course, as you know, is particularly true for crops and for livestock. The second contributing factor is that long before digital sequence information entered onto the scene, developing countries were concerned that developed countries had an unequal technological advantage to exploit genetic diversity for commercial advantage and for economic development. A third contributing factor is that the international access and benefit sharing agreements negotiated and which came into force in the 1990s and the 2000s, whose objectives were, among other things, to redirect benefits derived from the use of genetic diversity to developing countries. Those agreements generally have not lived up to their expectations in terms of redistributing benefits. In particular, they have not led to significant redirection of monetary benefits to providers of genetic diversity, genetic resources in developing countries. So access and benefit sharing related tensions with respect to genetic material were already there long before DSI came on the scene. DSI has been a little bit like pouring gas on the fire. The fourth factor, of course, is the relatively recent and extraordinary scientific and technological advances related to the generation and use of digital sequence information. New generation sequencing technologies have dramatically increased the speed and lowered the cost of generating sequence information. Genome editing and gene synthesis are creating unprecedented ways of using DSI as part of discovery research in crop and animal breeding. And again, as in the case of biotechnologies in the 1990s, subject to a number of exceptional, remarkable exceptions, China, India, Brazil, for example, many developing countries lack capacity to fully exploit these new scientific and technological breakthroughs. So in the end, there's a very widespread concern, particularly among developing countries, that DSI will contribute to widening, not closing, the technology gap between North and South. Now, finally, the Convention on Biological Diversity and its Nagoya Protocol and the Plant Treaty were not built with DSI in mind. They do not regulate access to sequence data derived from genetic materials, and they don't require benefit sharing from the use of such access to information. Instead, those agreements were developed on a model that genetic resources users would need to access genetic material to use in their new product development chains. So under the plant treaty, for example, benefit sharing is triggered when accessed genetic material is literally incorporated in new commercialized products. Under the Nagoya Protocol, access providers can potentially limit access to data derived from genetic materials, but only at the moment when they are making agreements to provide access to the material in the first place. So, as Rory will describe in more detail in the next presentation, DSI has opened up the possibility that research and development organizations can benefit commercially from being able to access genetic sequence data online, which is free from benefit sharing obligations, that would otherwise apply the underlying genetic material from which the data is derived. They can use their research leads to synthesize genetic constructs or edit genetic materials they already have, or which they can obtain from unregulated sources to continue their product development. So in the end, as a result of the combination of these factors, many countries, almost entirely from the global south, since the early 2010s have been calling for policy reforms to close the gap in access and benefit sharing rules that have been opened up and challenged by digital sequence information. Since then, the issue has come to dominate the agendas of several international fora, as Carolina just said. Now, just before I close, I want to note that 18 months ago, during our first primer webinar for CGIAR scientists, we reported that despite the maelstrom of international level activity in the intervening years, none of these bodies had yet adopted any new norms with respect to DSI and benefit sharing. That situation has changed in the last 6 months, as Isabella will explain later on in this webinar, with the adoption of some highly significant interim decisions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that Rory can take over.
Good. So thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michael, for setting the scene. I'm now going to follow up with a conceptual analysis of how DSI is changing how we use genetic resources and the implications for benefit sharing. Just to provide some context, the plant treaty recognizes 5 ways in which benefits arising from the use of genetic resources can be shared with developing countries. The first 4 are called non-monetary benefits, although impact studies show they bring huge economic benefits. And most of what the CGIAR does can be categorized into one of these, and no one disputes the potential of DSI to enhance these benefits further. The focus of dispute is the 5th one, the sharing of monetary benefits of commercialization. This is a difficult one for CGIAR because as a non-profit organization, it traditionally hasn't been involved directly in selling seeds. How do you share benefits that you don't create? So now the benefit sharing norms agreed to date under the CBD and the plant treaty are based on traditional approaches to product development, where value is created based on phenotype without using DSI. So as Michael has been saying, benefit sharing is based simply on which genetic resources in the breeding pool become incorporated into products that are sold commercially. And this is, or at least was, a rational basis for fair and equitable benefit sharing. But we've identified 3 reasons, I think, why DSI really makes a mockery of this principle. And I'll go through each of these now, beginning with the first, that DSI delinks use of genetic resources for research from their use for development. They're now used much more for upstream research. That research creates the knowledge and tools that we need for more effective and efficient development of products. So it creates huge benefits, even though the genetic resources used are often not incorporated into the final products. I've given just 3 examples. You can find further details and others at the link on the screen. So Arabidopsis, which is the basis of our most of our molecular genetics knowledge, reference genomes, which have been enormously valuable for developing the knowledge and tools we need for precision breeding, and genome-wide association studies, where you analyze hundreds or thousands of samples from different countries. Most of these genetic resources will never be incorporated into products, but the knowledge gained through the research transforms our ability to develop products. So our message to the policymakers has been that it's a mistake to tie benefit sharing just to the few genetic resources that are actually incorporated into food varieties, which is what's happening now. The second point relates to genetic modification, gene editing, and synthetic biology, the new technologies. So conventional ABS is based on genetic material incorporated into products through in vivo replication of DNA by mitosis and meiosis. But with genetic modification and gene editing, we can replicate DNA in vitro, removing the dependence on mitosis and meiosis. And with synthetic biology, we can go a step further, replicating DNA sequences in databases before reverting to material products. Now, this has been a highly controversial area, potentially driving a coach and horses through current ABS if you're fixed into the traditional way of thinking. One thing we've done is point out that the term unit of heredity, which is used in the convention and the plant treaty, is not defined in either of them. Now, there's a long history of literature suggesting that unit of heredity should be viewed as an informational concept. The unit that is transmitted from generation to generation is the DNA sequence, which is information. In life, that information is carried by nucleotides and replicated by mitosis and meiosis. But nothing in the convention or the treaty requires DNA to be the information carrier throughout the R&D pathway, and nothing excludes in vitro or in silico replication. So there is a good case for saying that this is all within scope. But as soon as you recognize it's all in scope, you have to deal with the effective impossibility of basing ABS on tracking and tracing. Now, the third one, that DSI enables discovery of unrelated genetic resources containing the same sequences. I think this has been recognized for several years as a loophole in the SMTA. So you can get material under an SMTA, you can use it to discover and sequence a valuable gene, and then find the same sequence in different material that is not subject to an SMTA. Now, this obviously creates a strong temptation to bypass the SMTA's benefit sharing provisions by doing the research on MLS material, but doing the product development on non-MLS material. It's worth pointing out the parallel with trait patents, which do protect against this problem. I think the centers that have explored using trait patents have already acknowledged that it would be a bit disingenuous to exploit this loophole in the SMTA while protecting their own IP with trait patents. IRIA, for example, has already stated that it will ensure that benefits are shared even where the loophole would say benefits don't have to be shared. So the overall message we have is that monetary benefit sharing can now be fair and equitable only in a multilateral system that delinks payments from incorporation into products, and that recognizes the value created through the use of DSI. And that requires a big change from the current ABS rules. So it's actually quite rational that we are going through this big process now. And when you think of the risks associated with adoption of inappropriate international policies, well, the worst thing is if negotiators stick to the current ABS models based on linking payments to specific products, then everything goes wrong. You get impossible requirements to track use of data. Therefore, users will avoid using regulated material and data. Therefore, benefit sharing will fail. Plus, open access data infrastructure is undermined. And therefore, agricultural R&D transaction costs rise, partnerships undermined, impacts are reduced, leading to negative impacts on food and nutrition security and economic development, climate change adaptation, and so on. So it is Really important to get it right, and really important for CGIAR to continue engaging to help get it right. So that's all I have had to say, and now we've had a look conceptually. Now we're going to look at some of the science with Mathieu, and as you'll listen to him, hopefully you'll be able to think of how these concepts relate to the science he presents. So I'll stop sharing my screen there and say thank you, everyone. Okay, over to you, Mathieu.
Thank you, Ray. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so good afternoon, good morning. So the objective of this presentation is to give a broad overview on how DSI are being used in the CGIAR and in particular in the genetic innovation initiatives. But before that, a little bit of context. Over the past decade, there has been a revolution in the next generation sequencing technologies with a drastic reduction cost of these technologies to produce data. This is what you see on the graph in green. And this has led to a rapid increase of the number of genome sequence in life science and obviously in plant too. And we can see that over the past year, there have been a clear increase in terms of numbers of genome sequence, but also in terms of quality. So this is what you can see also with the blue bar. It is higher than the green one, where we have almost complete genome at chromosome scale, which is a good news. And I think it's good to say that during this period, the CGIAR has been associated with multiple sequencing projects for the release of major food crops, either by providing material or by contributing to data analysis. So it started in 2011 with the potato genome with the support of SIP, followed by the banana genome with Biversity, and 2012. Then ICRISAT also was very much involved in the release of numerous cereals, and then CIAT and IITA for cassava, and so on and so on. So it happened for the major food crops, but it also happened for orphan crops, the so-called orphan crops, especially in Africa, and it happened for a few of them in the framework of the African Orphan Crop Initiative. And I think what is important is that we also show our ability to lead such a project, even based in Africa. We have this example of the lab genome at IRI. And because we got those reference genomes and because the cost continued to drop, it was possible to apply large-scale genotyping to the gene banks. And I listed here three main projects, probably the main ones, the 3000 rice genomes that was led by IRI, that also followed by the Seed of Discovery with a massive genotyping of wheat and maize. And more recently as well, the sequencing of more than 3000 chickpea genome. So this process, this genotyping project are happening in all gene banks at different scales. But this information is very important to compute, to perform a number of tasks for conservation method, for instance, to characterize the diversity of the gene banks, to better define the taxonomic classification, for instance, to conduct gap analysis. We can also look for duplicates in the collection to do some rationalization, and we can monitor genetic integrity. So this is for conservation, but it is also important for use because you can also identify useful alleles that are linked to a number of traits, and you can identify also donor materials that can be used, for instance, in breeding programs. So talking about breeding programs, DSI is also key in a number of operations. And you need DSI if you want to perform marker-assisted selection. If, for instance, you want to introgress some QTL in your edit lines. You need DSI if you want to perform gene editing, meaning that you want to modify one or a few genes that are linked to a specific trait. And if you are interested about that, I put the reference of a recent study that was published by Kevin Pixley and colleagues, and that gives example of how CGIAR is involved in such activities. And also, importantly, the CGIAR has also invested in genomic selection. which is an efficient technique when you want to shorten breeding cycle and you want to accelerate genetic gain. So I've been talking mostly about crops, but let's not forget that there is also animal research, and there as well, there is production of genomic resources. CGIAR Center contribute to a number of networks and projects where innovative methods based on DSI are developed, except that in that case, it's not regulated by the plant treaty, but more linked to the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol. In terms of data sharing, a number of information systems have been developed, and starting with SNP-seq to provide access to the 3000 raised genome and the SNP data. In the frame of the seed of discovery also, some germinate instances were put online to provide access to the wheat and maize genotyping. And we are currently developing a common portal in the GeneBank initiative to provide access to genotyping data of all gene banks, because there is a lot of information that is not available yet online. For breeding data management, again, there are a number of systems that were developed over years. The main one being supported by the Breeding Resources Initiative is the Enterprise Breeding System, the EBS. But some centers are also using BreedBase and the Breeding Management System, BMS, where you can find as well some genotyping data that are very important for the routine operation of the breeding programs. So, I think it's important to state that each time there are a number of experiments conducted using DSI, a large amount of data are being produced. And this can be a challenge in terms of storage, it can be a challenge in terms of computing facilities, and also in terms of skills to process those data. And again, we have a number of internal capacities in the CGIAR, where CGIAR has invested in several components, like some sequencing platforms. So to name a few, I can mention Saga at CIMMYT for genotyping, at ILRI, the Beca Hub, as well as the Center of Excellence at ICRISAT. We also have access to a number of high-performance computing facilities and also storage platform at ILRI or here at the Alliance. And we have also human capacities to do some bioinformatics analysis, but I would like to stress here that from my own experience, I think that we lack this type of capacity, and we should expand in this area, especially because I think it's important that we master all the data that are generated for germplasm, either conserved at the gene bank or created in breeding programs. And this is increasingly important because also we can play a role in capacity building, and this is very much in demand by our national partners. So with that, I hope that you are convinced that DSI is increasingly playing an important role for the modernization of cooperation in the CGIAR for the gene banks and the breeding program. And I also invite you to look at the new page on the CGIAR website, where we compile a number of information, including a number of presentations that were given by CGIAR scientists at special events, like the COP15 last year in Canada, as well as the plant treaty at the FAO. So thank you for your attention.
Hello, everyone. I think I'm next. Before I share my screen, I start my presentation. I would like to remind all of you that we have a question and answer function where you can write your questions, and Carolina, as the moderator, will ask us, the speakers, to address your questions at the end of each talk. If you prefer to ask your questions or make your comments orally, you can raise your hands, and Carolina will give you the floor. So just a reminder, because I see that you are being very shy. The question and answer bubbles are empty, a bit boring. So don't feel shy and ask your questions. If there is no time after each talk, we will make sure that there is time to address to hear your opinions and concerns and questions at the end of the presentations. And with that, I am going to share my screen. If I can find the button, Yes. Here we are. Can you please confirm that you can see? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So, okay, just for the purpose of, yeah, I stop my video because otherwise I see myself on the screen. It's a bit distracting. So, I'm going to provide an update on the status of international negotiations regarding digital sequence information, international negotiations related to how to apply the concept of access and benefit sharing to digital sequence information. So these international negotiations started more than 10 years ago. In the webinar that we organized in May last year, I made a presentation on how this issue had been addressed in international fora until then. And I understand, as Michael and others have said, that you have that presentation at your disposal. So I won't repeat that. I won't make that historical account here. Today, I want to focus on the decisions that were adopted under the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD, in 2022 and the current status of the negotiations. So the 15th conference of the Convention on Biological Diversity, or COP15, took place in December 2022 after a long delay due to the COVID pandemics. The COP is the highest governance body of the Convention, as probably most of you know, and it involves representatives that have been officially designated by national governments of all countries that are parties to this convention. But not only those governments are present in the COP, other the actors such as civil society organizations, international organizations, and the private sector participate in the meetings of the Conference of the Parties. These people can make proposals, but they don't make decisions. They are not part of the decision-making process. At this 15th meeting, the COP adopted the Global Biodiversity Framework, and you're probably also familiar with this too. This is a framework to guide everybody's efforts towards the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, including biodiversity for food and agriculture, covering ecosystems, species, and genetic levels. The framework has 4 overarching goals to be achieved by 2050 and 23 targets to be achieved by 2030. The sharing of benefits derived from the use of digital sequence information was integrated in the text of the Global Biodiversity Framework, in particular in Goal C and Target 13. As you can see on the screen, Goal C says that the monetary and non-monetary benefits from the utilization of genetic resources and digital sequence information on genetic resources, blah, 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 are shared fairly and equitably, including as appropriate with indigenous peoples and local communities. I have extracted here the most relevant parts. The approach that the COP took for the Target 13, which is about access and benefit sharing, is very similar. This target says that the country should take effective legal, policy, administrative, and capacity building measures at all levels as appropriate to ensure the fair and equitable sharing of benefits that arise from the utilization of genetic resources and from digital sequence information on genetic resources. So as you can see, the Global Biodiversity Framework considers digital sequence information equal to genetic resources for the purposes of benefit sharing. It says that users are expected to share benefits derived from its utilization and that countries are expected to take effective measures to operationalize the benefit sharing procedures. The international community has therefore taken a huge step ahead, and countries have made a great commitment here through the Global Biodiversity Framework, but this stake remains anyway pretty general and vague. But the COP didn't stop here in relation to DSI. It also adopted a resolution that sets the principles and defines the processes for the development of a benefit sharing system for DSI at the international level. This resolution, or this decision, is resolution 15/9, and I am showing on the screen some extracts from the most relevant paragraphs. Those numbers that you see on the right-hand side of the screen are the paragraph numbers for your reference. So these extracts, these things that I consider important for the purpose of today's webinar, for the subject matter of today's webinar. The COP said that the term digital sequence information will continue to be used in the negotiations. It confirmed that the benefits from the use of DSI should be shared equitably, and it called for more DSI with information on geographical origin and other metadata to be made available in public databases. It recognized that the tracking and tracing of all digital sequence information is not practical. Here is worth to notice that it says tracking and tracing of all DSI is not practical, but this implies that tracking and tracing some DSI may be practical, or at least doable. It also recognized the COP that the multilateral approach on the sharing of benefits is preferable, but it also said that there may be exceptions to the multilateral approach. Capacity building, development and technology transfer for developing countries to be able to generate access and use of DSI for research and innovation was considered a very important benefit, and this resolution calls for countries to share capacities, do technology transfer for this purpose. Most importantly, the COP decided to establish a multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing from the use of digital sequence information as part of the global biodiversity framework. And it set up a process to further develop and operationalize the mechanism and finish it by COP16, which will take place in 2024. This same resolution also put in place a working group. It created a working group to undertake the further development of this mechanism and to make recommendations to the COP for its finalization, as I said, by 2024. I'm sorry, I apologize in advance for this huge amount of text. I just wanted to show that this resolution also includes a long list of issues that this working group must consider for the further development of the multilateral mechanism. As you can see from this list, many things are still in the air. Yes, the COP has established this multilateral mechanism, but most of the fundamental aspects of it need to be defined, need to be detailed. I have highlighted in bold some crucial ones for CGIAR centers for the kind of work we do. So, for example, what will be the triggering points for monetary and non-monetary benefit sharing when using, generating, and sharing digital sequence information? Who will make contributions to the fund and when? The possibility to extend the multilateral mechanism to genetic resources of biological diversity. This current mechanism has been established only for DSI, but here they are saying that it may be extended to genetic resources as well. How the monetary benefits will be dispersed, who will benefit, when and how, capacity development and technology transfer, how that must take place as part of this multilateral mechanism. Also, what will be the relationship between this multilateral internationally established mechanism of benefit sharing and national system of access and benefit sharing? Will these national systems continue to operate? Will they be operating in parallel with this multilateral mechanism? How to ensure that both pieces of both regimes or systems do not enter in contradiction with each other or in conflict with each other? The role and interest of industry and academia and also the principles of the data governance. Most of the members of the COP agree that open access should be maintained, but what does that mean? What is open access at the end of the day? And what kind of data governance systems can ensure that open access is actually observed? Also, in this resolution, the COP included some criteria that should inform the deliberations of the working group. And these criteria refer to how this multilateral mechanism should be in general terms. So again, I have copied there the main points. It should be efficient, feasible, practical. It should generate more benefits than cost, be effective, provide certainty and legal clarity for both providers and users of DSI, not hinder research and innovation, respect open access to data, be compatible with international legal obligations, and supportive with other access and beneficiary instruments, and take into account the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. That is a very quick summary of what the COP adopted. In December 2022, the first meeting of this working group is scheduled for November this year, so just in a couple of months. The COP is the CBD COP is not the only body that has been dealing with digital sequence information. There have been advances also under other international conventions. First, under the Plant Treaty, DSI is a crucial issue that negotiators will have to address as part of the process to enhance the functioning of the multilateral system. This process started, I think it was 2012. It was then interrupted or suspended in 2018, and it was relaunched last year in 2022. And one of the reasons for suspending this process, this negotiation for the enhancement of the multilateral system, was that countries could not agree on how to deal with DSI within the context of the access and benefit sharing under the Plant Treaty. So now they have to face this challenge. They need to address DSI as part of these negotiations to enhance the functioning of the multilateral system. And the second international convention I want to talk about briefly is the Treaty on Marine Biological Diversity of Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction. It may not so relevant for us since the CGIAR Center's work fall outside the geographical scope of this treaty, as far as I know, but it is worth mentioning that because it represents a valuable precedent for the negotiations under the CBD and also the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. Under this marine treaty, the benefit sharing process is articulated into phases. First, when the treaty enters into force, developed countries will have committed to start making annual contributions to special fund as a way of sharing benefits. And they will make these contributions until the treaty conference of the parties decides benefit sharing modalities and agrees on a series of benefit sharing modalities from the utilization of genetic resources of marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction and associated digital sequence information. The second phase starts when these benefit sharing modalities are operative, and in this phase, the COP will review and monitor the functioning of these modalities and take action if necessary and accordingly. It is important to note two potential gaps in this access and benefit sharing regime, which are that, well, first, DSI is not defined under this treaty either, and this treaty doesn't also define developed countries. And since these are key terms and concepts for the functioning of the system, the operation of the system may be hindered by this gap. This is all from my side. Happy to answer questions and listen to your comments.
Okay, CGIAR, I'm going to talk about the contributions we've made to these fora that Isabel just described over the last 18 months. And again, we're choosing 18 months because we had a webinar 18 months ago that covered up the period leading up to then. So we're really updating. But we participated in a lot of the fora that Isabel just mentioned, particularly the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Plant Treaty, also under the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization's Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. We haven't been involved in the BBNJ or the PIP framework discussions. But of course, one of the difficulties we face is that all of these fora operate in relative isolation, but they're all addressing pretty much the same issue. But at the end of the day, as international agricultural research and development organizations, we're going to end up having to operate simultaneously under all the new rules that are eventually adopted. And you can imagine the life of a genetic resource or a DSI being regulated at different times under these different regulatory regimes that may be set up by these different fora. So one of the key objectives of CGIAR and engaging in these negotiations is to promote the adoption of identical or at least practically very harmonized rules under these bodies, informed by an appreciation of how genetic resources and digital sequence information is actually accessed, is actually used, and is actually shared in the process of agricultural research and development. Now, we don't make decisions. We're not states. Countries make decisions at these fora. Stakeholders like us, the best we can do is try to influence what stakeholders, what countries and contracting parties decide by getting their attention, raising issues, informing them about the science that we're engaged in so that they'll make decisions that reflect our reality. And that is kind of motivates the strategies we adopt as we attend these fora and share the information we share and approach delegates the way we do. So I'm just going to go quickly now over some of our activities in these different fora. My screen is not moving in recent years. So yeah, in the last 18 months of the Convention on Biological Diversity, CGIAR participated in a number of intersessional meetings or small meetings and consultations coordinated by the CBD Secretariat, wherein they were considering options for access and benefit sharing for digital sequence information. And those intersessional meetings and processes feed into the larger meeting. And of course, they all fed in at the end of last year, the end of 2022, at the Conference of the Parties of the CBD in Montreal. And as part of our efforts, in the lead up to that meeting, we released a pretty lengthy report entitled Digital Sequence Information is Changing the Way Genetic Resources Are Used in Agricultural Research and Development and the Implications for New Benefit Sharing Norms. And we had a side event related to that with the same name, wherein a number of CG scientists made presentations based on the work they're engaged in that showed how DSI is used and is facilitating use of a much broader range of genetic resources in the research and development streams in which they're engaged. We also, some months later in March of this year, made a second written submission entitled Issues for Further Consideration Concerning Digital Sequence Information. And that was largely in response to that list of issues for further discussion that the COP 15 listed in decision 15.9. If you recall that rather text-heavy slide of Isabel's that had all those list of issues, well, we wrote a paper addressing those issues from the point of view of agricultural research and development. And we had this side event. I see some of you who participated in some of these side events are here on this call today. Sarah Heron is here. So is Carolina Sansoloni. A shout out to you and thanks for your engagement. Under the Plant Treaty, sorry, maybe I'm just a little bit further back. So right now, the CBD Secretariat is taking all these submissions from us, from all the plethora of other organizations that are chipping into this. And they're writing a synthesis paper that will be used as the basis for the first meeting of the open-ended ad hoc working group on digital sequence information, which will be meeting in November this year. And because we've been making these submissions, we're really sort of CGIAR is primed and ready to go in a nice position, I think, to be making contributions to that meeting. And that meeting, by the way, is immediately before the 10th session of the governing body of the plant treaty. So whatever comes out of that meeting, the CBD meeting in November, will have a big impact on it'll set the tone for the governing body meeting and how it deals with digital sequence information under the multilateral system. And it's really just too hard to tell right now how it's going to turn out. Okay, so then under the plant treaty, again, we've been involved in the last 18 months in a number of informal meetings and consultations hosted by the Secretariat, hosted by the Swiss government, hosted by the Meridian Institute, wherein it was being discussed whether or not we should be relaunching negotiations to enhance the multilateral system, and whether or not benefit sharing from digital sequence information should be included in the scope of negotiations to enhance the multilateral system. We were in favor of both, and we're happy to report that both of those are ongoing. Of course, CGIAR also participated in the 9th session of the Plant Treaty's governing body in October in India, and also in the first meeting of this reconvened open-ended working group to enhance the functioning of the multilateral system in July this year. Should also note that in our submissions to the governing body, we have summaries of our analysis of options for benefit sharing that we think are reasonable based on science in 2 of those submissions. And we've also developed a third rather lengthy submission, many of you in this webinar contributed to, entitled Technical Assistance to Strengthen National Agricultural Research Organizations' Capacity to Use Digital Sequence Information, a submission from CGIAR. We also made submissions to the 19th session of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the Commission on Genetic Resources, FAO, wherein we shared the DSI-related papers that we made for the CBD. We did that also for the governing body. So we're submitting a lot of the same material to all of these bodies in the hope that they too will slowly but surely work towards a common appreciation of the issues and the ultimate policies that they adopt to address the issue in a linked up, harmonious way. We had a side event again in I think it was May earlier this year, excuse me, of FAO's Intergovernmental Technical Working Group on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. The side event was entitled Using DSI to Improve Accession Management by Gene Bank Managers. So all of the written submissions I've just referred to and the recordings of the panel presentations, the side events that I've also referred to, are now available on these dedicated web pages on the Gene Bank Initiative. And Cinzia in the chat has shared a link. So she shared 2 links. One is to the webinar from May 2022, and the second link is to this page that has all of our submissions, all of our side events, all the PowerPoint presentations and recordings thereof that were made at those side events having to do with DSI. So we're trying to develop a resource page that not only encapsulate the histories of our contributions, but also is useful to people who are interested enough to have tuned into this webinar to do some more digging. Now, the basic positions that CGIAR is elaborating across these submissions to the CBD, to the Plant Treaty, to the Commission, with respect to DSI and benefit sharing have been pretty consistent over the last 10 years, honestly. I think they haven't really changed a lot. And I don't think that that's not because we're not dynamic. I think it's a slow-moving train, and I think we were careful in the original identification of issues we thought were important, and our perspectives I think have lasted over time. And I'm just going to provide a sort of a thumbnail sketch of some of the highlights. We don't have time to go into the nitty-gritty of all of those submissions that I just described, and I encourage you to go look at them if you do have the time and interest. But here's a thumbnail sketch that DSI is critical to agricultural research and development, and it's changing the way we use genetic resources in agricultural research and development, as in ways that Rory described earlier. CGIAR recognizes that many developing countries, with a number of extraordinary exceptions, are not able to take advantage of DSI to the same extent as users in most developed countries, and that consequently a long-term solution for access and benefit sharing for DSI must involve capacity strengthening, information sharing, and technology transfer, what are called non-monetary benefits in the lexicon of the plant treaty and the CBD, so that we can close in the long term this technology and capacity gap between North and South. And to this end, CGIAR has been very supportive of efforts at the levels of the plant treaty and the government and the CBD to identify outstanding capacity strengthening needs, particularly in the global South. And we've worked to raise awareness about the enhanced role that CGIAR can play ultimately in meeting those capacity strengthening needs in the future once they're systematically articulated through those assessment processes. So, while we do believe that the largest important gains for developing countries can be made through the so-called non-monetary benefit sharing approaches, capacity building, technology transfer, information sharing, we clearly signaled that we also recognize the frustrations and aspirations of those countries that want to see more and more consistent monetary benefit sharing. And I think, at this point in the game, it's naive to think that there will be that there's possible to have a new deal for benefit sharing and digital sequence information that doesn't include substantial increases in monetary benefit sharing. The global South has made it very clear that's key to them. So we see that, and as a result, we've come out in favor of policy options that can potentially give rise to substantially increased monetary benefit sharing, and B, simultaneously provide policy support for the continued and expanded availability of digital sequence information and genetic resources through open access infrastructures, right? So CGIAR has made the case in this context that bilaterally oriented approaches to regulating DSI, with all of the requisite tracking and tracing of sequence data and the development of particular research projects, would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, with extraordinarily crippling high transaction costs. And by contrast, we've been saying for 10 years now that if there are going to be new norms, they should embrace multilateral approaches. And here I just want to pause for a second to recall some of the key elements of the CBD COP15 decision that Isabel shared a few moments ago, and frankly, to celebrate the fact that they are in line with what CGIAR has been submitting for some time. CGIAR, the COP15 agreed that a solution for fair and equitable benefit sharing should provide legal certainty and clarity, should not hinder research innovation, should be consistent with open access to data. COP15 recognized that tracking and tracing of digital sequence information is not practical, and that multilateral approach to benefit sharing looks like a good basis for a solution. Very interestingly, it encourages users to deposit DSI in open access repositories. And of course, it did create decided to create a multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing, including an international fund. So, we are happy to note there is this confluence between the content of our past submissions and recent decisions of COP CBD. So that's all good news, but there are a lot of caveats here, and there's a long way to go over the next 2 years to work out the details of how the CBD's multilateral mechanism will work, including who will be required to pay, how much they will be required to pay, under what circumstances, what will be the triggers, and how will the system actually promote legal certainty for users. And in parallel, of course, how will the process for developing monetary benefit sharing under the DSI, for DSI in the context of the enhancement of the multilateral system of the plant treaty work, and how will they work together? How will the two systems speak to each other? These are huge questions, and it's a lot to address in a 2-year schedule that's been set out. So there, to look forward then, there are many ways to develop a benefit sharing mechanism that can be described as multilateral, and some would be much more conducive to agricultural research and development than others. The simplest multilateral approach would be for national governments to assume responsibility for making payments to a centralized benefit sharing fund to be agreed by following formula to be agreed by negotiators. And then national governments would have the latitude to decide to collect from their constituent companies or not, according to formula that were relevant and appropriate under national circumstances. And in this case, DSI generation, sharing, and access could not be affected at all. And this is to go back to the answer to the question that was raised earlier about how do you treat DSI in different databases. According to this approach, you just leave it. You could leave it the way it is and add to the data that's in those databases. However, while simple, it shouldn't surprise you to know that this option of having governments play this upfront proactive role is not popular among country delegates. And they are, of course, naturally reluctant to volunteer their countries for assuming new financial responsibilities. You see this in all international multilateral fora. Think about what's happening in climate change and agrobiodiversity. So biodiversity, other biodiversity fora. Governments are really allergic to assuming responsibility for making payments. So, most contracting parties continue in this IBS framework to insist upon this transactional approach, wherein payments should be coming directly from commercial users who have accessed and used DSI. In short, models where the commercializers pay and not countries. Now, of course, those models that they're insisting upon have sort of not proven to work terribly well over the course of the last 30 years of ABS experience, but one has to appreciate the reluctance that contracting parties have when they're facing these problems, and also the kinds of pressures they're under to look for alternatives other than assuming responsibilities and financial obligations themselves. So recognizing this reluctance on the part of contracting parties as a fallback plan in the context of the negotiations to enhance the plant treaty's multilateral system, CGIAR has also over the years contributed to developing the so-called subscription system option, whereby subscribers could decide to subscribe and make annual royalty payments to the treaty's benefit sharing fund based on their entire portfolio of seed sales, not just on a product-by-product basis, regardless of whether or not a particular product in their portfolio incorporated material or DSI at the end of the day. So the subscription system would have the advantage of less tracking and tracing of subscription uses, but it would still have the disadvantage of leaving unaddressed the possibility or likely avoidance by users who could get access to digital sequence information elsewhere. And it would also give rise to related challenges about needing to monitor uses of databases and genetic resources by non-subscribers. So again, getting back to this question about what do you do about data that's already in databases? If we have a subscriber model, someone may have to pay attention to whether or not the people accessing are subscribers or not. And if they're not subscribers under the plant treaty, what are they under the CBD? It gets a little complicated. This is, again, a reason for looking for simple solutions where national governments might play a more proactive role up front. Finally, we've repeatedly raised concerns about the potential negative impacts of ending up with two different regulatory regimes, one for material genetic resources and one for DSI. For example, plant genetic resources being regulated or available under the plant treaty's multilateral system, but associated DSI being regulated under some new regime under the CBD. This would be, well, a little bit ridiculous and a completely artificial division of regulatory jurisdictions that would not reflect the reality that most of our conservation efforts and most of our plant and animal breeding efforts rely on and engage in when we're accessing, using, and sharing both genetic material and DSI. So in short, whatever emerges in the next period of negotiations across these different international fora, it really must be harmonized and in sync, and keep admin burdens to a minimum for actors who are engaged in the kind of work that we do. So I won't say more than that, appreciating that time is pretty much running out. So thank you.